First of all, I would like to thank Punjab Ophthalmic Society and All India Ophthalmic Society for giving me opportunity to present. My topic will be role of neuroadaptation in improving patient satisfaction after IOL implantation. So cataract surgery is the most commonly performed ophthalmic surgery. Patients are gradually shifting from traditional IOLs to high-end premium IOLs, which provide reduced practical dependence and in turn greater patient satisfaction. But these premium IOLs do have some limitations and need meticulous pre-operative calculation, realistic counseling and perfect surgical technique. Neural adaptation is the capacity of human brain to adapt to new stimuli, situations and experiences. Understanding the process of neural adaptation is essential for ophthalmologists to better anticipate its impact on presbyopic patients who expect spectacle independence after cataract surgery or a refractive lens exchange. Just a brief of anatomy, the primary visual cortex, it lies in the posterior pole of the occipital lobe, and it corresponds to broadband area 17 and surrounded by the extrastriate cortex, broadband area 18 and 19 and various other broadband regions which transmits this information via the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. Primary visual cortex transfers the motion and position of the object via the dorsal stream and the color and the shape of the object through ventral stream to the temporal lobe. Then, excuse me. Yes. So there are various types of presbyopic correcting IOLs available in market. There is usually multifocal IOLs, trifocals, idophiles and accommodative IOLs. Multifocal IOLs, they uses a non-physiological optical method to improve near vision. Various optical designs have been meant to provide excellent visual acuity for distance, intermediate and near. Multifocal IOLs provide overall spectacle independence in 81 to 85% of patients. But there are certain disadvantages with multifocal IOLs like decrease in contrast sensitivity and mainly dysphotopsias, which could be positive or negative. I am explaining next slides. Dysphotopsias, these are the important cause of patient dissatisfaction after uncomplicated cataract surgery. Mostly they are transient in nature and disappear spontaneously within few weeks or in the first year after surgery, possibly due to neural adaptation. Sometimes they are persistent and require conservative or surgical treatment. They could be positive dysphotopsias like glare, halos, starbursts, rings, and they are generally evoked by the external light source coming obliquely from the periphery. Negative dysphotopsias are described as dark crescent-shaped shadow on the temporal side of vision. With negative dysphotopsias, symptoms will improve with pupillary dilatation and worsen with constriction of the pupil. Patients with negative dysphotopsia are more frustrated as they lose some part of their vision, some piece of their visual field, and they generally require surgical treatment as compared to patients with positive dysphotopsias. Parameters such as visual acuity and other causes of impaired vision such as dry eye or retinal diseases like AMD, diabetic, they doesn't seem to be related to the incidence of dysphotopic symptoms. Idophile, same principle like single elongated focal point to enhance the depth of focus. Generally they provide excellent intermediate vision, but mostly patients require spectacles for near visual acuity. Now coming to the neuroadaptation part, human brain manages to combine disparate images from two eyes in order to achieve a single unified picture rich with depth perception. Every point along the hierarchical visual pathway contributes to interpretation of an image. Visual cortex is well equipped to mediate most interocular rivalry, including the focus disparity resulting from anisometropia. So more and more cataract surgeons are turning to premium IOLs to compensate for presbyopia in their patients. Multifocal lenses, due to their design, they override the. So with multifocality, we create intraocular rivalry. Adult nervous system is remarkably plastic and its ability to modify input is quite rapid. Neuroadaptation can occur in response to either a monocular or a binocular visual disturbance. Visual adaptation depends to a great extent on visual awareness. In case of monocular visual disturbance, the brain learns to compensate by altering its perception. Depending on the lens and the patient, neuroadaptation may happen sooner, later, not at all. Majority of patients will adapt to multifocal IOLs within 3 months to 1 year. About 5 to 10% of patients will never adapt. Personality and lifestyle of the patient can provide clues to patient selection. Patients with rigid type A personality who tends to notice or hold on to every visual detail is probably less able to adapt than a patient who is more easygoing. Understanding and explaining the neural adaptation process to patients is critical. Development of strategies that facilitate neural adaptation might be effective approach. Like in patients with ND, we ask the patient to cover the contralateral eye with a patch, and then the scotoma reduces in cases of ND. Then video games have been proved to promote brain plasticity. So conclusion, due to the increase in life expectancy and the changing lifestyle, like everybody is now on laptops, computers, most catered patients and prescriptive patients want to be spectacle independent. Although a lot of oils are available in the market with different features, but no oil till date is ideal. So neuroadaptation definitely plays an important role in optimizing visual quality, reducing the dysphotographic symptoms, and improvement in contrast sensitivity after premium oil implantation. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Thank you.
Just one question to our adaptation, but what about a study, and have you seen any cases where actually the neuro adaptation fails in those cases, and what are the causes for it? You get my point. Then you are telling 5% of the patients don't neuroadapt. So have you seen, or when you have presenting something, so have you seen what is the cause why they don't neuroadapt in those cases?
Because every patient, the nervous system of every patient that behaves differently to different lens types. Even in a journal by George Elio, what he is saying, if a patient doesn't adapt to a single kind of multifocal lens, like it is diffractive, so replace it with refractive IOL, or if
No,
refractive.
so have made the things like if you are seeing for a EDOF or you are seeing for a trifocal, so which type of lenses do not neuroadapt? If you have put that point, that would have been better. Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Vikas. So, from further on, I request all the presenters to stick to time, to the time limit of 4 minutes. So, I invite Dr. Azambir Brad for his presentation on anemic retina, tip of the iceberg. So, probably he is not there. Dr. John Jacob Matthew. I invite you to present your poster on SD-OCT analysis of RNFL changes post-phacoemulsification.
Good morning all. I'm Dr. John Jacob Matthew. I'm from Christian Medical College in Ludhiana. I'm here to talk on my paper, spectral domain OCT analysis of RNFL changes post-phacoemulsification. And one minute. So as we all know, retinal ganglion cells, they form the RNFL, they form the axons, that forms the RNFL, and following which they form the optic nerve, right? So in certain diseases like glaucoma, we see a degeneration of this RNFL thickness and ONH cupping, which leads to vision loss. And I'm sorry, I'm not able to view the slide in here. So, it's not just glaucoma that affects the RNFL thickness and ONH cupping. It is also the non-glaucomatous diseases such as multiple sclerosis, NMOSD, Alzheimer's disease that affects the RNFL thickness and ONH parameters. So our study aim was to check the changes in RNFL thicknesses post cataract surgery, mainly phacoemulsification, and the changes that we see with an SD-OCT. So in our study, we included 60 patients, of which they were all 18 years above. And we included patients only those who are posted only for phacoemulsification with IOL, in-the-bag IOL implantation. And we excluded patients with any sort of ocular opacities and any sort of other retinal, those patients that were not willing for follow-up. So in our study, we pre-op evaluation, we did a proper thorough ophthalmic investigation. That included BCVA, IOP, fundus examination with plus 90-degree diopter post dilation, and we checked the patient also on slit lamp biomicroscope. Following which we did an SD-OCT scan preoperatively after dilation as well, and we noted all the changes that is required for RNFL changes, and patients were followed up post 1 month, and the same evaluation was redone again. So in our and for the cataract grading, we used the LOX3 grading system, and in our results we found that there was a in our age distribution, we found there is a majority of in the age range of 51 to 71 years of age, and then we had a slight male predominance of 53%, and our signal strength, we noticed that there was a significant post cataract surgery. A significant increase in our study, it shows significant increase in superior and temporal quadrants, and most of the changes were seen in posterior subcapsular cataract, and as per you can see in the graphs, the changes were also noted as per each cataract type and the quadrant wise, and we did notice that a few other studies also had similar findings, but at the same time they were also contradictory, mainly because they used a different OCT machine, and they had a different sample sets which are lower in number, around 30 to 40, and we found that there was a significant change overall, but in our study we mainly found there is a significant change in the superior and temporal quadrant, and to conclude, a significant improvement in signal strength was noticed, which improved the cataract imaging quality, and quadrant well analysis also showed a variation from other studies, which to conclude, to show that we have to re-evaluate every single patient that we suspect glaucoma before starting any glaucoma medications for such patients post-surgery. Thank you.
So just one question. You have included all the glaucoma patients in your
Yes, ma'am. We have no.
So how do you say that you have not compared the normal with the glaucoma? Have a conclusion saying that RNFL has a significance in these cases.
Yes, ma'am. So in our case, even though our exclusion criteria, we didn't have an exclusion for glaucoma per se, we had no patients which were diagnosed with glaucoma. So even with non-glaucomatic patients, prior to they were not diagnosed, even those patients, we saw a significant decrease post-surgery. There was RNFL thickness was lower, post-surgery it increased. So we should not misdiagnose patients.
No, so what do you conclude? Because that initial part it will increase, that is already seen and proved. So what does your study show, or what do you give the message to the thing?
My message is we should always do a reassessment of RNFL thickness and ONH.
Yes, you can do, but does the RNFL has a significance of treatment in anything? Because just doing anything doesn't have, because already so many things have been done, and what is the conclusion and novelty of your study?
In my study, we found that there was a significant, even without prior diagnosis of glaucoma, they found that there was a significant increase in the superior.
So tell me why there is a significant increase only in your superior quadrant, what you were talking about. What is that it was showing of superior?
It goes against ISNT law. So
in that case, your study design should have been different. You should have done a comparative study, and then you should have told, because you are taking a normal Generia and talking about it, it doesn't have a significance. Okay, anyway, it's a good study, but to do anything, think in future about it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So was it a prospective study, Dr. Matthew?
Yes, ma'am, it is a prospective study.
Okay. So to what do you attribute the increase in RNFL thickness post-surgery?
Ma'am, mainly the clarity of signal strength, clarity of the imaging that was done pre-operatively because of the cataract. The image was not clear, signal strength was not clear because of that image we received were not of proper values. So post-surgery we got more clarity of we can see, we were able to image it more clearer.
So did you include all patients who had some complication during the surgery also, or were they excluded?
No, ma'am, they were, none of our phacoemulsifications cases were eventful.
Okay, so that was not mentioned, I think.
Sorry.
Probably that should also be mentioned.
Yes.
Fine, fine, okay.
Thank you.
So next I invite Dr. Navdeep Kaur for her poster presentation on the topic to determine the association between vitamin D levels and severity of diabetic retinopathy in type 2 diabetes.
My topic is to determine the association between vitamin D levels and severity of diabetic retinopathy in type 2 diabetes mellitus. The purpose of study: vitamin D plays a major role in pathogenesis of retinopathy. It exerts anti-inflammatory effect by decreasing the proliferation of lymphocytes, natural killer cells. Of my study, vitamin D plays a major role in the pathogenesis of diabetic retinopathy. It is hypothesized that deficiency or insufficiency of vitamin D plays an important role in severity and pathogenesis. Therefore, we carried this study to find out the association. Aim of the study was to evaluate the association between vitamin D levels and severity of retinopathy in type 2 diabetes mellitus. Objectives were to estimate vitamin D levels and to analyze the difference between means of the vitamin D level in 3 groups. Those 3 groups were diabetes with no DR, diabetes with NPDR and diabetes with PDR. It was a hospital-based cross-sectional analytical study. Diabetic patients coming into OPD were taken into the consideration. So diabetes patients, serum vitamin D level and other investigations were checked. OCT was done to look for the following: central subfield thickness, disorganization of retinal inner layers, ellipsoid zone, cube average thickness, retinal pigment epithelial alterations and diabetic macular edema. On the basis of fundus examination, further 3 groups were made: A, B and C, no DR, NPDR and PDR, and data was further analyzed. Patient more than 18 years of age and with media clarity and pupillary dilatation were included in the study, and the patients with ARMD, retinal vascular pathology, hyperparathyroidism, and subjects taking vitamin supplements were excluded from the study. All the data of all the data of 120 patients were recorded in Excel sheet, and it was analyzed on micro Excel software. Demographic variables were in the form of frequency and percentages. Association were calculated using a chi-square test, and comparison was done using ANOVA test. Level of significance, p-value less than 0.05. So these were my results, and they emphasize that importance of both long-term and immediate glycemic control in diabetic retinopathy management. A significant negative correlation was found between vitamin D levels and diabetic retinopathy severity with p-value less than 0.001. The patients with no DR, they had normal vitamin D, and the patients with PDR were deficient in vitamin D levels. Low vitamin D is linked to increased risk of diabetic macular edema due to blood-retinal barrier breakdown and fluid accumulation in the macula. Lower vitamin D may also contribute to retinal neurodegeneration and disorganization in diabetes. Neuroprotective benefits of vitamin D was supported by the clinical evidence. Ellipsoid zone disruption analysis also revealed a significant progression pattern with the prevalence increasing from 0% in no DR to 27.5% in PDR group. So lipid profile in triglyceride and cholesterol, they also show significant differences between the groups. A comparison with the prior research, XY et al. Revealed that patients with PDR had notably lower serum 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3 levels, and Suzuki et al. Noted a higher incidence of diabetic retinopathy in individuals with vitamin D deficiency. So for discussion, vitamin D has a potential protective mechanism against DR. It acts as an anti-inflammatory, reduces the inflammation by regulating immune responses and decreasing the pro-inflammatory cytokines. It is antioxidant, anti-angiogenic, inhibits abnormal blood vessel formation, neuroprotection, protects neuronal cells from damage, preserving retinal function, and RAS regulation suppresses the renin-angiotensin system, regulates blood pressure and fluid balance. It enhances the body's response to insulin, improving the glycemic control. So our studies finding of strong dose-dependent relationship between vitamin D levels and diabetic retinopathy severity supports the idea that vitamin D has pleiotropic effects on retinal health. So this was my master chart. Thank you.
Dependency. So have you done any titration of the doses and seen that how much dose will be beneficial in each of these cases?
No, ma'am, we haven't checked the patient
Because
after-
you wrote in that dose dependent, so that is what I am asking you. Because you just took vitamin D deficiency in which of the cases, and then what is your implication if you are saying that it has a significance, so how much should be given, a normal dose or different dose in these cases?
Yes, ma'am. In this study, I haven't calculated the vitamin D levels after giving the supplements. We have just taken one.
So it is a hypothesis you are putting on that it has a strong correlation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So, would be any confounding factor? You have not calculated the FBS and HbA1c for these patients, or have you?
Calculated.
So could that be a confounding factor? What is the mechanism that you suggest? According to you, like as the deficiency increases, the severity of diabetic retinopathy increases.
Yes.
So do you like what percentage of or what is the strength of this correlation? What I want to ask is,
Yes,
for example, suppose as a routine for all diabetic retinopathy patients, we are not getting any vitamin D levels done.
Yes,
So do you suggest that that should be done? Because otherwise that doesn't have much place in management of diabetic retinopathy.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, we have done HbA1c and FBS of every patient. So the patients with those were having PDR, they had HbA1c level more than 6.5 or 7. That was included in my study, and FBS was also high in those patients. And so for this study, I had personally taken, I told the patients to do vitamin D. In routine, we were not doing the vitamin D for all the patients.
So probably as a conclusion, if we get the vitamin D levels and they are deficient, we can supplement the vitamin D levels, but otherwise we have to go ahead with all the diabetic investigations and treatment.
Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine.
Thank you.
And Dr. Mehak Mangla for her presentation.
Morning, ma'am. So my topic today is bilateral astrocytic hematoma of optic nerve with retinitis pigmentosa. It is a rare association that was seen in a patient. So 43-year-old female resident of Bathinda was seen with progressive loss of vision, and the past history of patient was that the patient in the childhood when she was 5 years of age, she had a progressive gradual painless diminution of vision, which was recently it was associated with watering redness and photophobia, and eventually she had a complaint of complete loss of vision. There was no previous family history of the patient, but the patient's 12-year-old daughter, she had afflicted the similar complaints with gradual progressive painless loss of vision since the age of 6 years. On examination, rest of the findings were normal, but the vision of the patient was PL denied in both eyes. On fundoscopy, the glistening translucent mulberry-like pre-retinal lesions were seen over the optic disc with bony spicules present in the mid-periphery. The blood vessels were attenuated with cellophane maculopathy. On OCT disc, when it was done, we could see that there were dome-shaped thickenings with retinal hyperreflectivity and black shadowing and calcification were seen in both the eyes. Blood profile of the patient was normal. Viral markers were non-reactive. Also, the patient was ruled out for tuberous sclerosis, as this is a common association with astrocytoma. Renal ultrasounds were done, but there was no abnormalities like renal cysts or angiolipomas present in the patient. This was a fundus photo of the daughter. And on the daughter's OCT disc examination, again the dome-shaped thickenings were seen with hyperreflectivity and calcifications. It was not as progressive as in mother, but they were quite relevant. So astrocytoma hamartoma, it is a benign tumor, yellowish grey mass with semi-translucent appearance. It's a rare one. Obviously, the association with the redness retinitis pigmentosa is again a rare association, and we need to see with other departments, as the daughter of the patient was a pediatric one. So we should have consulted the pediatrician, but the patient also we should have undergone the genome also, ma'am. But the patient was not very affording, and they were not even interested in doing so. So that's why. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Having this rare association and the patient was not affording genetic
Yes,
thing, but which type of gene are you suspecting will
Yes,
be
ma'am.
affected? Which type of a genetic? It is autosomal dominant, no?
It is autosomal
So
dominant,
which
yes.
type of panel of gene you would have advised for this case?
Ma'am, we could not advise at the first.
No,
call.
which you would have advised. He could not do it, it's different. You know the panel of genes, no? So
Yes,
which
ma'am.
one would have you
Ma'am,
advised?
TSC gene is associated with astrocytoma.
Yeah,
with
but that is
biopsy.
also association with retinitis pigmentosa.
Yes, ma'am.
So that is what panel of genes you would have asked?
RB gene, ma'am, that could have been.
RB gene.
Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you, Dr. Mehak. Next I invite Dr. Panku Bagla for a poster presentation on heart-shaped conjunctival cyst.
Good morning everyone. Today I'll be presenting on topic heart-shaped conjunctival cyst. So conjunctival cyst is a thin sac which is filled with fluid found either on or under the conjunctiva, and they represent approximately 80% of all the cystic growths of the conjunctiva and has a potential to develop in multiple locations: eyelid, conjunctiva and anterior segment, and they may further classified as primary or secondary cysts. The secondary cysts are more common than the primary cysts. Primary cysts are usually congenital and typically remain hidden in the fornix, gradually increasing in size with age. So the aim of our case was to report a case of a giant conjunctival inclusion cyst which was idiopathic in nature, the excision of which led to a large conjunctival defect for which amniotic membrane transplantation was further done. So a 68-year-old male presented to us with a complaint of diminution of vision and foreign body sensation in the left eye for past 1 year. He also noticed a small mass in the left eye which was painless and has gradually increased in size over a period of 1 year. He also had a history of cataract surgery with IOL implantation in both the eyes 4 years back, and patient denied any history of trauma. His best corrected visual acuity in the right eye was 6 and 6.6 and in the left eye was 6.18. On slit lamp examination, both the eyes were pseudophakic. The left eye showed a solitary giant dumbbell-shaped lesion measuring 15 into 15 mm located in the supranasal quadrant of the conjunctiva. This was the lesion which was seen on the evaluation. On inspection, the cyst appeared pedunculated. On palpation, it was found to be white-based and immobile due to its firm underlying adhesions. The trans-elimination was positive. Rest of the examination was unremarkable. The B-scan was also done to rule out a deeper interocular extension of the cyst. On histopathological examination, the cyst was lined by non-keratinized conjunctival epithelium, and as we can see, there are a presence of the apocrine nodes also. So further, the patient underwent meticulous surgical repair of the cyst under local anesthesia. The conjunctiva around the cyst was separated by blunt dissection. The cyst was firmly adherent to the underlying sclera, so it was just excised in toto without rupturing the cyst wall. The resultant bare sclera defect was about 16 into 19 mm. So since there was a large defect, the amniotic membrane was procured and processed and used to cover the defect. So diagnosis of conjunctival inclusion cyst was made, and patient was post-operatively started on antibiotic and steroid eye drops for a period of 1 month. And over a 1-year follow-up, the defect healed well and no local reoccurrence was seen. Post-operatively, the patient's symptoms were relieved and his best corrected visual acuity improved to 6.6. Amniotic membrane was found to be in situ and was adequately covering the defects. So to conclude, this case signifies the importance of a timely cyst excision with amniotic membrane grafting, wherein the primary closure is not possible, which yields good outcome. Preserving vision and averting a reoccurrence is a mainstay of treatment, which was achieved in case by en masse removal of the cyst with amniotic membrane transplantations. Thank you. These were my references.
What is the cause for inclusion cyst?
Ma'am, in our case, it was kept as idiopathic, but the other causes can be any history of trauma or any history of a previous.
Your patient did not have trauma.
No, ma'am.
So in your case, what could be the cause for it?
Ma'am, at first we thought it could be likely due to the cataract surgery which happened 4 years back. It could be a likely cause, but in our case it was ruled out that since it was a very uncommon site, the cyst was found in a supranasal quadrant, and the cataract excision was 4 years back, and the patient only started experiencing this soft mass growth 1 year back. So we ruled out SICS also, and it was kept as a primary cyst.
Okay, as a primary cyst.
Right.
So would you excise all conjunctival cysts or would you be selective?
Ma'am, we usually prefer if the patient is symptomatic and the patient is that the cyst is gradually increasing in size and it's obscuring the visual axis, so we mainly go for that patient for excision. Thank you, ma'am.
So next I invite Dr. Ramandeep Kaur for a poster presentation.
Good morning. My topic is unusual presentation of lobular capillary hemangioma on the eyelid. A lobular capillary hemangioma is considered a benign vascular tumor of the skin. Capillary hemangiomas can be seen as an abnormal proliferation of a normal tissue in location, which commonly seen in boys. It presents as a red to purple, flat to raised, most commonly seen in the upper eyelid. The purely intradermal lesions are bright red in appearance and refer to as strawberry nevus. They blanch on pressure and may increase in size on crying. Capillary hemangiomas are without pulsation and have no brule. So a case report, a 9-year-old female patient from Gurdaspur, Punjab presented in IOPD with right upper eyelid mass, which patient felt on rubbing her eyelid 15 days back. Mass was red in color, non-mobile, was formed to touch and gradually increase in size over time. It was not associated with pain, redness and tenderness, no history of any ocular trauma, no prior medical or surgical treatment history. On ocular examination, left eye is within normal limit with best corrected visual acuity of 6/6. In right eye, on eyelid, a red well-defined lobular mass measuring 1 into 0.5 into 0.5 centimeter in diameter were present on upper eyelid margin. Mass was formed to touch, non-tender, non-reducible, no local rise in temperature, no abnormal vessels observed, transillumination test negative, fluctuation test negative, no signs of inflammation or no mechanical ptosis present. Rest of the anterior segment is normal with normal fundus examination. Diagnosis, the provisional diagnosis was made a single capillary hemangioma based on its presentation and decided that an excisional biopsy would be required to determine the nature of mass and rule out other benign or malignant lesions. So the patient underwent a surgical excision of mass under local anesthesia and biopsy was obtained in the same setting and sent for histopath. The wound was closed using 60 Vicro sutures. Intra and post-op period was uneventful. On histopath report showed globular, partly skin covered, grey white to grey brown soft tissue piece measuring 1 into 0.8 into 0.8 centimeter. Features are those for lobular capillary hemangioma. So in this patient was followed up on day 5 and day 15 where the wound has healed and no signs of leakage, infection or redness or swelling seen. Sutures were safely removed on post-op day 15 with excellent osmosis. Hemangiomas are described histologically as capillary cavernous mixed or sclerosing. Capillary hemangiomas is one of the most common benign orbital tumors of the childhood, affecting up to 5% of the infants under 1 year of age. Capillary hemangioma itself has a nomenclature of its own: infantile, juvenile, benign or hypertrophic. It could be a sequelae of metastatic. The histological type of hemangioma is more commonly congenital than it's required, which made this case quite intriguing as there are only a handful number of cases. The differential diagnosis could include benign lesions such as cavernous hemangioma, lymphangiomas, orbital cyst, vascular ectasis, and bacillary angiomatosis. It may also include more malignant lesions like Kaposi sarcoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, or metastatic. The diagnosis is often made clinically with exclusion of differentials with AST of histopath. However, imaging may be necessary in diagnosis of large tumors to note its vascularity and extension. Most effective treatment till date would be a surgical excision, especially in the patients who fail to respond to alternative, which may include beta blockers, radiotherapy, diathermy, intralesional bleomycin or corticosteroids. A commonly discussed treatment modality was the use of beta blockers, namely propranolol, due to its vasoconstrictive role. So lobular capillary hemangiomas commonly present during childhood and are most common blind tumors in that age group. Diagnosis is made radiographical imaging, clinically or radiographic imaging may be used. Though in most cases the management remain conservative, it may resolve spontaneously. A number of cases have been managed surgically for cosmetic regions and to prevent further complications like amblyopia or astigmatism, where the lesion is bigger. Surgical interventions may be opted. So therefore, each patient must be managed according to their individual presentation and conditions in order to effectively treat a capillary hemangioma with minimal complications.
So, why didn't you use any drugs, like you have said that there is role of some drugs also for such cases?
Actually, patient, the child, she's child, and their parents wanted ki like we have to remove it, matlab without any testing drugs.
So are there any cases where you would want to go in with the drug therapy or conservative management before going in for surgical?
Ma'am, if the lesion is large, then we have to excise it for to decrease the complications like astigmatism or amblyopia for further. But if the lesion is small and the patient is compliant, we can go for intralesional bleomycin or corticosteroids injection in those cases.
Any systemic causes, this was a single lesion you found, it was a child. So giving, starting initially was excision indicated, or you could have gone for propranolol in these cases. Child is there. Or, and in which cases you have this lobular, you are telling capillary hemangiomas, any systemic causes should be evaluated? Or we keep it as idiopathic and just treat the child of eye only?
Ma'am, capillary hemangiomas can be present on mucosa, like mainly because
You had a single one, so if a recurrence comes and something, so should we treat them initially this way or should we do a systemic examination? That's my only question.
Ma'am, we have to do systemic examination also.
Okay.
So next I invite Dr. Mannat Jyot Singh for his poster presentation on epidermal and cyst of the upper lid, an unusual presentation.
I am presenting on epidermoid cyst of upper eyelid. Epidermoid cysts are benign, slow-growing tumors that result from the sequestration of ectodermal tissue during embryonic development. They are linked by keratinizing squamous epithelium and contain keratin debris and cholesterol crystals. While they can occur anywhere, they have a predilection for the head, neck and trunk, typically present in adolescent and late adulthood. Usually solitary, elevated, round, freely mobile subcutaneous mass with smooth overlying skin. They are usually not attached to the overlying skin but may be fixed to the underlying periosteum. They tend to grow slowly over time and are usually asymptomatic unless they become inflamed, rupture or exert pressure on adjacent structures. The case one is a 54-year-old male patient from Gurdaspur, Punjab who was chef by profession in Dubai, presented in IOPD with slowly progressive left upper eyelid swelling since 2 years. Swelling was not associated with pain, redness or tenderness. Few small nodules were present behind both ears and on forehead. No prior treatment history present. There was no history of ocular trauma. Family history: patient's father had medical history of multiple lipoma excision from his back. Derma and ENT opinion were taken and probable diagnosis of neurofibromatosis was done. And on ocular examination, right eye appeared to be within normal limits. In left eye, a large round regular swelling present on the left upper eyelid measuring 2.5 centimeter in diameter. Swelling was well defined, firm, smooth, no local rise in temperature, non-tender, non-reducible, non-compressible, no abnormal vessels observed, transformation as test negative, fluctuation test negative. It was free from underlying structures and no bony attachment was felt. Overlying skin was normal with slight hyperpigmentation. No signs of inflammation was observed. The difference in the marginal reflex distance between the left and the right eye was 3 mm, suggesting moderate mechanical ptosis. Pre-operative investigations, FNSC report suggests smears prepared shows presence of anucleate squames and few squamous epithelial cells against the background of acellular debris. No epithelioid cell granuloma, malignant cells seen in the smears examined. Features of benign epidermal inclusion cyst were reported. In MRI, a hyperextensive lesion in the left periorbital region plane measuring 3 into 2.5 into 2.2 centimeter epidermoid cyst. Preoperative blood investigations were within normal limits. After thorough examination, investigation, diagnosis of epidermoid cyst was made and excision was planned under local anesthesia. Case 2, a 4-year-old boy from Gurdaspur, Punjab was brought in IOPD with a complaint of swelling left eye which was present since birth and noticed that size has been increasing recently. There was a history of similar swelling that had been excised 2 years prior, but it recurred at the same site, but there was no record of the same. There was no relevant family history. On examination, right eye was within normal limits. A large round swelling, regular swelling present in the left upper eyelid measuring 1.5 into 1.5 centimeter in diameter. It was well defined, firm, smooth, no local rise in temperature, non-tender, non-reducible, non-compressible, and no abnormal vessel observed. Transformation test negative, fluctuation test was negative. It was free from underlying structures and no bony attachments was felt. Underlying skin was also normal. No signs of inflammation was observed. On FNAC, cytological smears show presence of good number of enucleate squames and few squamous epithelial cells against the background of eosinophilic granulose material. Features suggestive of epidermal inclusion cyst. On MRI, well delineated oval shaped lesions seen in the region of the left upper eyelid superiorly in the subcutaneous plane. It was located laterally near the left superior orbital ridge. It measures approximately 1.5 into 1.3 into 1.0 centimeter. Underlying bone appears to be normal. Treatment and incision on the upper eyelid skin was made and blunt dissection of the cyst from the skin was done without rupturing the capsule. Discussion. Epidermoid cyst was our second most common type of benign periocular cutaneous lesions, mostly arising from infundibulum of the hair follicle. It can be spontaneous or associated with trauma. It is benign, slow growing, and predominantly found in males versus females, and these are mostly sporadic. 1% have been noted to have malignant transformation to squamous cell carcinoma. These can be found anywhere, and it is a subepidermal nodule which is filled with keratin, and epidermoid cyst occurring before puberty in unusual locations and number raise the suspicion of a syndrome. Conclusion, most are slow growing, elevated, round and smooth. Cyst may get secondary infection. Smaller cysts can be treated with marsupialization. Excision around the periphery of the cyst but leaving the base of the cyst wall. Thank you.
So, what were the differentials for these cases?
Differentials, ma'am, most common can be the chalazion, sebaceous cyst, and pilar cyst, dermoid cyst. Most common. Thank you.
Thank you. So I now invite Dr. Hanur Kaur, the last presenter for the session, to come and present her poster.
Everyone, today my topic is traumatic optic neuropathy assessed by visual evoked.
Excuse me.
नहीं आ रहा है.
So traumatic optic neuropathy, the incidence is 0.7 to 2.5% in trauma, and as we know, the mostly affected population are the young adult males. So the diagnosis is mainly clinical, which is based on recent history of ocular or head trauma, RAPD, visual acuity loss, defective color vision, visual field effects, and CT and MRI. But they miss the certain traumatic lesions. So the integration of functional diagnostic tools like VP is required. They are especially useful where the clinical assessment is inconclusive, like bilateral tone, unreliable pupillary responses, or unclear trauma history. So our study highlights the crucial role of VP in assessing both direct and indirect forms of tone, emphasizing the need for ongoing research and technological advancements to enhance the diagnostic accuracy as well as the patient outcomes. R was the prospective cross-sectional observation study over an 18-month period. So we screened about 64 patients, out of which those with having other causes of optic neuropathy, with intraocular refractive surgery, with posterior circulation changes, or with any other ocular pathology were excluded from the study, while those with a history of craniofacial trauma within preceding 3 months or exhibited any clinical signs of TON were included, and they were labeled as clinical diagnosed TON. So these 45 eyes undergo the pattern reversal VP according to the ISCEV protocols. Since most of the eyes in our study were under 30 years of age, so we used the normative data for this age group. So out of the 45 eyes, the 37 show the normal VP while the 8 eyes show the normal VP. So the figure 1 is showing in which the checkerbox spectrum is shown to the patient, which reverses at the frequency of 2 reversals per second, and the figure 2 is showing the prolonged P100 latency in the right eye. So our results were the clinical diagnosed TON were total 45 patients. The mean age were 37 with 71% male. So the major cause of TON in our study was the road traffic accidents, and the mean duration of presentation was 40 days. We also calculated the NIHSS and MRS score, which was 0 in patients, indicating that there is an absence of focal neurological deficits. Majority of patients show RAPD and color vision deficiency with normal fundus and normal neuroimaging. So these were the findings of the pattern reversal VP, in which 7 patients show non-recordable results, 8 patients show the normal VP, 13 show prolonged P100, while 7 show both prolonged P100 and decreased amplitude. We also calculated the diagnostic utility of pattern VP in our study, taking the clinical criteria as the gold standard. So it came out to be high sensitivity and specificity, which shows that it can be valuable adjunct in diagnosis and follow-up. Relatively higher predictive value of 76.96 shows that the abnormal VP findings are consistent with clinical diagnosis, but the lower negative predictive value shows it has a limited exclusionary power. So we also compared the eyes with the normal and abnormal VPs, which shows that those with normal VP were having better BCVA, intact pupillary responses, and preserved color vision, while those which show the abnormal results were having poor BCVA, high incidence of RAPD, and frequent color vision deficiency, and our results were statistically significant. There was no difference observed in social demographic or injury-related variables. So in concluding, number 1, PEVRP is a quantifiable and objective assessment tool for TON. Number 2, it correlates with the extent of visual impairment. Number 3, it adds the clinical value where the examination is challenging. Number 4, it is a non-invasive. But the limitations were it has a low negative predictive value, so it does not reliably exclude TON, especially in early or mild cases where the functional deficiency may not be sufficient to disrupt the cortical responses. And number 2, our sample size was small, which show the decreased statistical power. So R is an ongoing study. We are including more patients for better statistical results. So to conclude that, the VP should complement rather than replace compressive clinical and imaging evaluations. Thank you.
So when do you advise the VP to be done in TON cases? What is the criteria? When should be done? Like clinically, sometimes they come late. So what is the criteria? Any patients you are getting of TON, so they should undergo VP? Are you advising that?
Ma'am, we have included those patients who came within 3 months of trauma. We excluded all other patients, like more than 3 months and everything.
So that is why I'm asking, the 3 months and within 1 month, does it have a difference? You'll be getting it?
Ma'am, in most of the cases, TON is a clinical diagnosis that patient presents with a diminution of vision, RAPD. But in some cases, there can be no history. There will be only a history of trauma. So we advise in patients.
No, I'm just asking you. You told excluded within. You have included everyone within 3 months. So that is what. Have you done a study to find out within 1 month and within 3 months? Is there any difference between? So if you can do that also, it will have a more significance. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
So thank you all, and we are concluding this session. So we call upon all the speakers to come. We'll take a group photo and then hand over the session to the next. फोटोग्राफर कहाँ है?